Hi everyone and welcome to my AZUREWRATH Rogue Guide for Season 9. This is something I'm personally very excited for because, well, this. So this is Penetrating Shot featuring Eaglehorn. In fact, the pre-buff Eaglehorn, because the patch is not live as of the recording of this video. But you're gonna see a lot of projectiles flying all over the place if you decide to play with this version of the build. So I want to walk you through how to make this possible. This is one of the strongest, actually the strongest rogue build out there in Season 9, based on the AZUREWRATH unique sword that triggers a huge lucky hit, like elemental damage proc. So you can combine this with lots of attack speed, lots of lucky hit, and general damage multipliers, and actually have a powerhouse of an AoE clearing build. And you can even do this with several different setups. So another setup that I will show you is Twisting Blades, which works almost exactly the same, but there are some little tweaks between those. And technically you can play this with any of the core skills that can trigger a lucky hit somewhat decently. So you can also do this with Flurry, you can also do this with Barrage. And well, in some cases there is actually a pretty significant gap between using just the core skill on its own or trying to build into this AZUREWRATH lucky hit proc shenanigans that we are about to do here. Overall, I gotta say, I'm really looking forward to this. I think it's going to be very fun to play Penshot or TB especially. It's kind of like a blast from the past, and they turn out to be pretty good this time around. If you look at our endgame tier list, for example, we have Penetrating Shot pretty high ranked, and right after that there's also Twisting Blades, both of which are these setups that I'm about to describe you. Now that being said, we have the Maxwell guides here, so I will also show them off briefly. They are made by Matthias and Ava respectively, and I have my own planners that are a little bit tweaked, so there might be some slight differences or so, but it's largely the same stuff anyway. Just one note here for Twisting Blades in particular, it's only the pit push variant that is built towards this AZUREWRATH stuff. The rest of the guide is actually Poison TB, so just kind of keep that in mind. But for example, for Penshot, the entire thing is going for that basically. Meanwhile though, if you are a Twisting Blades enjoyer, I do have my planner here, and my planner actually goes here with like the Ancestor variant, so you can start this a bit earlier and you can kind of go from there as soon as you have AZUREWRATH. So this is obviously the core of the build. You need to have a good item here in order to even start playing this, and before that you will have to progress with something else. So we do have starter variants. You can do check those out in Maxwell as well. For example, you level up with something like Dance of Knives. Pretty easy to go all the way to like Torment 2, Torment 3 or so before it kind of hits the wall, and by then you can probably get this item and maybe do a switch, or you just start blasting with one of our other leveling guides, including Penshot or Twisting Blades that we have, and you can progress that way. But more importantly, you need to find this item somehow, and not just that, you want to have an item power 800 version, so with an ancestral version here, because there is a pretty large gap between AZUREWRATH being 750 or 800. So just to show this off briefly here, if you go to 750, this proc suddenly does a lot less damage, as you can see here. So with no masterworks and nothing, this is only 1600 damage. And well, this goes up quite a lot if you go to 800. It's already like ×4 or something like that. And then you can masterwork that higher, you can get a GA. And well, suddenly this thing does like 10 times the damage or something like that. And not just this, but it also has a hidden, most likely bugged effect where it multiplies its damage with your sheet attack speed. So what that means is that if you have our attacks per second here, for example, if you look at our like stat sheet, then basically you take the base speed of your weapon and multiply that with the attack speed bonus that you have, and then that is another damage multiplier for AZUREWRATH for whatever reason. So this is just how it works. And the same thing applies also to, for example, elemental surge tempers. So in the case of Penshot, for example, we also have like a poison proc here. The same thing happens there as well. It's just a lower value compared to AZUREWRATH. In addition, this is a lucky hit effect, so it also scales with your lucky hit values. And for that, we have the Fists of Fate. This is like the proc item basically. You can get up to 140% extra lucky hit. There's also other various lucky hit sources, but effectively this kind of like doubles your chance to proc, which means double the DPS, and it also has a great stat. It gives a vulnerable proc, and for example also has this unique effect where you deal more damage on average. So overall this thing is ridiculously good for a build like this and needs to be included, and you want to also try to get a good version with good lucky hit on that. And what this means in the end game is that you have quite a long and steep scaling curve actually, where first of all you get a good AZUREWRATH, you try to masterwork that thing up, then you try to get a lot of attack speed, try to get that to actually the attack speed cap of around 200% bonus distributed between the two different caps. And then you also want to get the Fists of Fate. So you have various axes of scaling your damage all the way, and eventually it ends up quite far at the top of the tier list. So that is the baseline of how the AZUREWRATH setups work, and then we just try to get as much damage in there as possible with either just more aspects that multiply our generic damage. So for example, we have Vehement Brawler here, we can have Conceited there. There's also, for example, Cold Clip. In this case, with Penshot, for example, we use Trick Shot. On Twisting Blades, we use the Blade Dancer aspect, the skill-specific aspect for the Spinning Blades, or here for the extra arrows. And likewise, you can do the same with other core skills as well, like Barrage. You don't really need to have any mythics here to make this work properly. So, for example, I have the Ancestral variant here for the Penshot build. So you can go for Call of the Nameless, very strong rogue unique helm that you can easily acquire, and try to get some trick attacks on that thing, or maybe the Unstable Elixirs is also not bad. And well, the other items can also be replaced. Accelerating, for example, is a pretty good passive here. Accelerating, for example, is a pretty good aspect here. And it's also not really such a struggle to manage the resources without Star Disguise. So the idea is that we just shoot Penshot, for example, all the time, and we will easily get our resources back, for example, from innovation ranks. Here with this passive, with all the lucky hit that you have, you proc this multiple times per second, even like per pack, per shot. So you always get the resources back easily. In fact, this can go so far that you can throw in something like a Quacks rune. So for example, if you want to do like a push setup, you can do Ahu and Quacks, and you can actually proc Quacks on cooldown. So every second you'll get the double damage effect for the full second, basically. Even on single target, this can happen, basically. So this is how much lucky hit you have, and when there's more targets, you're gonna just proc everything like crazy. One novelty in Season 9 is the buffed Eaglehorn. So we don't have that in the planner just yet, but you have it here in the patch notes. So Eaglehorn got a guaranteed bounce at least once, and apparently that will even happen without a wall, which is kind of wild. So previously Eaglehorn did a bounce every 4 hits. This is what you saw on the clip at the start, but now it bounces a lot more than that. So things are about to get a lot more interesting in the future here. I'm very excited to see this in action. Right now we haven't seen it actually. But well, what you want here is you just get a cast twice, for example. You get 100% chance pretty easily with just a GA on that stat. That's it. So you don't have to do like any kind of tempering and so on. And then you just try to get a bit more out of the other stats here. And voila, you have this crazy projectile all over the place shenanigans going on, and like this you will proc your AZUREWRATH. As for the skill tree, we can go into that briefly. So the TLDR is your core skill is not doing any damage, so we only put 1 point here so you can get the upgrades. More importantly, here on Penshot, for example, we have the free shots. So when there's multiple elites, you actually get multiple free shots that just kind of like fly out on their own when you hit a pack, which is very nice. And you can also get the knockdown and slow here, and that's also pretty useful. You don't actually get anything from this 50% extra damage done effect here. This is for the Penshot itself, which again doesn't do anything. It's just a carrier for lucky hit. So you see here in this planner, for example, we have a 208% lucky hit chance. And a lot of people might always, and now a lot of people might ask, why do we even go above 100%? Well, the reason is because math. So the way that this works is that we take this skill lucky hit chance and then multiply it with the value of the proc that we're trying to trigger. So in this case here, we have a 40% chance. So we would have to multiply this with it times 0.4. So if you just do that, we're at 8%, so divided by 100, and then times 0.4, because that is the value that we have on the AZUREWRATH. And likewise for any kind of lucky hits effects that you might have, you would do exactly the same calculation. And you see here that the outcome is 0.83, so this is the equivalent of an 83% chance. So if you try to scale your lucky hit a little bit higher, In fact, you would need 250% on your skill. Then you would trigger AZUREWRATH every single attack. And then going beyond that value is actually not really giving you any more benefits. But we're not at that point here with this planner, so we don't have to worry. Another important skill that we have in our setup here is the Shadow Clone. So Shadow Clone just got a fresh nerf, but it is still pretty useful to include. We kind of need to have an ultimate on rogue builds in general because of no witnesses, for example. And Shadow Clone just helps you out with more procs, more attacks. It does some damage on its own, but we don't fully lean into Shadow Clone anymore in the future. So with those nerfs, it's not that crazy. It does just less damage now, but also grants you damage reduction. It does grant you unstoppable, which is kind of neat. And it also triggers various effects, like, for example, your preparation rogue specialization here. So every time you press your Shadow Clone, you will reset all of your other cooldowns, and then you spam your core skill in order to reset your ultimate, so you can kind of repeat the cycle. And everything else here is effectively just trying to pick up either some mobility. So we have dash, shadow step, for example. There's Caltrops, which is very useful to just throw on an elite pack or throw on the boss especially. Just a really strong damage buff, especially from the enhanced Caltrops there. We have Dark Shroud as well. This is triggered passively thanks to the Umber's aspect, but before you get that, you have to press that manually, so keep that in mind. And you can kind of like tech slot something in there that you want to have. So you have the smoke grenade here. I just like throwing the smoke grenade, which is also useful, for example, to disable suppressors and these kind of things. You can also go with the poison trap if you want. So you can even potentially throw like an imbuement in there and then try to go for like some of the other alchemist aspects or so. So there's a bunch of options here if you want to try to like make this a bit your own, but I went with those. And as for the Paragon, it also looks very similar on all of these builds. I actually kind of just copied the Paragons between them, and this is what it looks like. So we have Dance Macabre here. This is basically just a damage multiplier that is always active because you press a dash or you press a smoke or anything, and you will get that. Then we have Exploit Weakness. With all the lucky hit, we basically have that fully stacked almost instantaneously whenever it drops. So it only lasts 6 seconds after capping it, but you get there in like 1 second or so. So there's a bit of a downtime, and that's it. Then we have the No Witness board here. So this is a now 40% multiplier every time you press your ultimate for 10 seconds. So you try to press a Shadow Clone roughly at least every 10 seconds. Sometimes more often if you want the unstoppable, for example. And lastly, there's Eldritch Bounty. So this is not represented in the planner just yet, but this was also freshly buffed to now just be a permanent passive bonus. So you don't have to do anything with imbuements anymore, and it's just really strong. So we include that. And for the cliffs, we just try to slot in anything that kind of gives us damage. Control is a pretty strong one, since we have pretty easy access to chill and freeze on a rogue. We include that, but also keep in mind that, for example, on bosses, where when they're not staggered, you will have a lot less damage. So this is a pretty typical rogue issue, to be fair, where you just try to build some crowd control procs so they can stagger bosses. And if you have like a really long boss fight, if you're going for like a high difficulty, or you do like a layer boss and you were a bit optimistic, for example, or let's say on a high pit push, at some point you will just not really stagger bosses anymore, and a lot of these crowd control based damage buffs will not activate until they can be staggered. So just keep that in mind. You hit kind of a brick wall pretty soon at some point when you do a push, just because you have a harder and harder time trying to stagger bosses. And most of the other glyphs are kind of like just other generic buffs here. We have Fluidity, we're going to try to press an agility skill every few seconds. We have Versatility, that mostly buffs the clone, but also helps out with pretty good stats. Canny is for non-physical builds, AZUREWRATH is a cold proc. And lastly here is the Headhunter, it's just like a generic extra damage buff. This might be a different glyph depending on what key passive you run. So here, for example, on the Penshot setup, we run Victimize, which is also freshly buffed. And for example, on the Twisting Blades setup, we have Close Quarters Combat here. So in that case, we have the Turf glyph here on the last board in order to stack close damage, which then buffs the core passive here. But one note about Victimize is looks like this now. So it's effectively just a 75% damage increase. It does carry a little bit of damage on its own, so it has kind of similar to the AZUREWRATH proc, this chance to deal some AoE explosion, but I don't think this will really contribute a lot. But technically we are scaling this almost exactly the same way as the AZUREWRATH, but it's just a much lower value overall, I think. so it's probably not really gonna feel like a lot. But just a 75% increase here is very consistent. And for example, for penchant, you can play at range. You don't have to think about anything like keeping up a close quarters combat buff or anything. You just blast into packs, the arrows fly and bounce and are free and happy, and well, everything explodes. And that's also pretty much everything you need to know about how AZUREWRATH builds work. So as again, there are some nuances depending on what exact core skill you're using. Technically, you can even do this with basic attacks or anything you want. Also, other classes build their AZUREWRATH setups in fairly similar ways. So get a lot of attack speed, get a lot of lucky hit, and then try to scale generic damage modifiers. And that's about it. And with that, I conclude this guide. So if you want, go check out the Maxwell guides as well. So we have them here. I showed them earlier, Twisting Blades and Penshot. I think our Barrage guide might also have an AZUREWRATH variant in there. Otherwise, you can find my planners here. So there's the Twisting Blades that I have and the Penshot as well. So I've been cooking this myself and been playing this on the PTR. And I'm quite excited to see it in action. So for now, hope you liked this video. Good luck in Season 9, and see you guys next time.